Everyone. I'm continuing my series on the tactics of the left. In the last installment, I spoke about Michel Foucault and the effect that he had with trying to smear everything as being bourgeois, and if it was bourgeois, it needed to be attacked and destroyed, or at least deconstructed, dismantled, the power over people's lives, broken by these kind of institutions and everything that he termed bourgeois. And when I mean institution, I don't mean the institutions of the state. I mean just the everyday things that we accept as normal in society. Everything from the family, relationships, hobbies, work, the law. Everything has to be attacked and dismantled because it's coming from a bourgeois place. So in this one, I want to talk about the other communist influencer, profound influencer. Actually, he's you can see his handiwork all throughout the Western world at the moment. You've heard about the Long March of Institutions, so I'm going to be talking a bit about that. So his name is Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian communist philosopher from the 1920s and 30s. So already his background is that he was advocating the kind of Marxist activism and revolution. A very different way from, say, Lenin did, or Trotsky did, or even subsequently Mao Zedong did. He had a very different approach, but it's one that has lasted to the present day. Whereas I think the kind of violent upheaval tactics of Lenin, Mao, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, I think that's kind of waned. It was very much a kind of mid to late 20th century thing. We're dealing with something very different, and Gramsci is responsible for it. So you've probably heard of this phrase called the Long March through the Institutions. Well, this is Gramsci's grand plan that he came up with. So essentially the tactic is that it's the responsibility of the educated, the university educated academic to be the revolutionary, to be the prime revolutionary. It was no longer going to be these kind of charismatic figures like Lenin. It wasn't going to be that anymore. Gramsci came up with this idea of how you could have a revolution, and indeed a perpetual revolution of the type that Mao would advocate, but without ever having to get up from behind your office desk. It was a kind of his non-violent answer to revolution. It would take longer than the conventional uprising that involved violence and weapons and actually physically sort of killing your opponents. This would be done very differently over a much longer period of time. Now, Gramsci was working in 1920s and 1930s in Italy, fascist Italy. So inevitably he fell foul of the fascist authorities there and was imprisoned, did some writings. So there's a collection of his writings called the Prison Diaries by Gramsci. That's primarily where I'm deriving this from, what he wrote there. So that's the primary source material. And he died in captivity in fascist Italy. So that makes him a kind of martyr figure as well, which gives him the kind of heroic cred. So essentially, Gramsci's plan is that you have these university-educated kind of academics, or I would call them pseudo-academics, because if they're following Marxist philosophy, they're not that bright to begin with. That's just my personal opinion. So, but what he said was that once you are one of these academic figures, then you go into the institutions, these bourgeois institutions that Foucault railed against, and the others, Sartre and all the other kind of 20th century Frankfurt School, and also the French Marxist philosophers of the 20th century. So they would identify bourgeois, this is bourgeois, and it must be destroyed. Gramsci advocated you destroy it from within. over a long period of time. So it's for the academic, the university educated, who are aware. And we have a word for that these days, in the 2020s. We call it woke. Obviously, that term was not around in Gramsci's time. He uses equivalent language, but the meaning is the same. You are awakened. You are aware. You have ascended to this higher Marxist consciousness that gives you insight, gives you everything that you need to launch this revolution. And now you can do it from behind your desk chair. So you go into the universities, you go into schools, you go into the law courts, you go into the police, you go into the government, the civil service, and you bide your time, and you just work to increase what you want, your goals, within these institutions that you've infiltrated. You introduce more and more Marxist philosophy, anti-bourgeois philosophy, until you have captured that institution. Obviously, this is a long-term strategy. But some people have pointed out that this was started in the 1960s. I think that's partially true. I think that's there's evidence to suggest it was start to happen in the universities in the 1950s. I refer you to a video I did some time ago about the Marxist academic Malcolm Caldwell, who got into SOAS, the Asian Studies Institute in the United Kingdom. He got into there in the mid-1950s, because he was a very promising graduate student, and the senior university authorities, who were not left-wing but liberal, thought, oh, this chap's so clever, we've got to bring him in and we've got to give him a position. So that was happening in the 1950s, and I believe if you have a look at the influence of a lot of the particularly French and German post-war philosophers, they're infiltrating, they're getting into academic circles in the 1950s. So I don't think the 1960s, everybody thinks that was when the radicalism happened. It did in some ways. Well, I think that was kind of immediate. I think it was very youth-driven, knee-jerk stuff, and some grew up and moved on from being kind of radical activists of the 60s. But if you're looking at where the academic capture started at the academic level, the professorship level, you're looking at the 1950s, and the 60s just sort of adds to that. So into the 70s, you have the archetypal left-wing sociologist professor in Malcolm Bradbury's The History Man. I thoroughly recommend people check that out. I've mentioned that on my channel before. Go and check out The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury, because it's archetypal of this kind of captured institution and Marxist academic type. So we saw that the academic sphere capture beginning in the 1950s and continuing. We start seeing the media capture probably in the 1980s, I would imagine. I'm looking back at in time. I don't think the media capture was that strong. I think it started in some areas. I think with the press starting to openly veer towards the left in reaction to Margaret Thatcher. So I think the media started going in the 80s, definitely in the 90s, in the run-up to Tony Blair's new Labour government. I think from about 1992, the BBC is starting to drift that way with the appointment of John Birt as Director General. I think that's when the BBC was really starting to drift leftwards. But I think we have to look at the Blair government as the ultimate realisation of what Gramsci was talking about. So this was all common. This was all, I wouldn't say it was commonly known at the time when Tony Blair became Prime Minister and New Labour took office in the United Kingdom. But the information was out there. Maybe it was a little bit harder to find. Maybe you had to pay a little bit more attention to it, because a lot of people were being swept up by the whole Cool Britannia thing and ding dong, the Tories are out of power, and a lot of this new phenomenon of middle class, so kind of affluent middle class, sort of drifting towards the progressive left, and it was happening there. So not a lot of people paying attention, but as I never voted for New Labour, and I was very disappointed when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, I started noticing things that were being reported in the press about what they were doing. So the first thing in the first year of the Blair government was effectively doubling the size of the civil service. So you would have the long-term civil servants, but they would be partnered with a Labour political secondee to the department, so that would have a political commissar, as like in the civil service. And what has happened since then is that the old guard, the civil service that were around in the 70s, 80s and 90s, all retired, moved on, passed away. And so what you're left with are the activists that were placed there by New Labour government and their successors. And you had an organisation called Common Purpose, sort of grooming, finding people at university level. They wanted to go into civil service, they wanted to go into the police, they wanted to go into academia, they wanted to go into business. And so this training cadre called Common Purpose that would give, supposedly on the surface, give these people sort of business and networking skills. But it was a network, and it's a network to place people into various positions of power. Former Metropolitan Police Commissioner Cressida Dick came up through this Common Purpose. Again, that's just Gramscian tactics, sort of create these cadres and then put them into sort of the institutions of state and kind of get them more politicised and more thinking along a single political track. So in America, we see this in other ways with the Soros Foundation doing things. They sponsor district attorneys who share their progressive ideals, and they sort of give money to them so they can get elected as district attorneys, and then from there, district attorney can then go on to become either a congressman or a state senator, get into the legislature. And so you have this kind of, again, this kind of pipeline to power through kind of Gramscian tactics of long marching through the institutions. And in another way, the World Economic Forum kind of does this young leadership program that they did that got Jacinta Ardern and Justin Trudeau fast-tracked into becoming national leaders of their countries. And you get the package deal of kind of socialist policies that follow in their wake. So this is something to be aware of. If you want to know, because a lot of people in recent years said, how on earth did we get a police force like we have today? How on earth are our civil servants working against the interests of the voters? How on earth does it happen? Well, in our schools, why are the schools preaching a kind of woke ideology, woke agenda? In the schools, they're supposed to be learning kind of valuable life skills and knowledge skills and all that. Well, this is the tactic that was used. It was conceived in the 1920s and 30s by Antonio Gramsci, and it's taken a long time, longer time than the sort of the violent revolutions of a lot of communist takeovers. But it's proven very effective because what the communist revolution, it required a certain amount of courage, physical courage, to get a weapon, storm the barricades, as it were. It takes kind of psychotic persona as well. If we have a look at the communist revolutionary leaders, and the fascist and Nazi revolutionary leaders as well, but there have been more communist takeovers in the 20th century than there were fascist and Nazi ones. And if you have a look, all the leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, General Giap, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. There's a psychopath gene in all of them. They're all prepared to slaughter thousands, if not millions, of their own people to achieve their ends. Whereas the Gramscian method doesn't require that. The Gramscian method requires more zealotry, like at a almost like a religious equivalent. You just need kind of apostles, as it were, and so it can attract a wider range of people. It can attract more people because it's non-violent. The Gramscian method of capture. Although, having said that, it's non-violent, it has very severe repercussions if you're on the wrong side of it. So part of the institutional capture, it's not enough that they gain control of an institution. It's that the people who used to run it and the people who would say no have to be pushed 100% aside. And we're seeing a kind of very passive-aggressive response to opposition. As I said, with the traditional violent revolutions, you just shot them or hung them or did something physically very nasty to them. Now you debank them, you deplatform them, you marginalise them, you smear them, you lie about them. And these are all things I'm going to be talking about in future episodes. But just as a kind of precursor, I'm mentioning them now because this is all an outgrowth of the Gramscian tactics, which is quite low effort. As I could be a Gramscian activist just sitting right here where I am in front of a laptop, and the amount of damage I could do. And I would leave you on this note. If they can capture it by sitting at their desks, so can anyone. So can conservatives. Use the tactics in reverse. But it requires a lot of patience and it requires a lot of effort. And it's very difficult doing that now because whereas I would say that the liberals and the centrists and the soft conservatives were very lax and very permissive of the very people who are trying to bring them down and trying to destroy them. They were very permissive. I don't think once the left have captured an institution, it's going to be so easy to pry them out. The one thing that does seem to work is hubris and incompetence. So eventually they run things into the ground because they're not bright enough to be able to run things. They spend all their time with these tactics and believing in this ideology, but the ideology doesn't work. So when they put it into practice, everything breaks. And so through incompetence, they will be weakened. And then people will be crying out for somebody who can make something work properly. And that's probably where conservatives or people who lean more to the right or at least centrists who are very high in conscientiousness, that's when they'll come back in. But it's going to be a tough old slog to get to that point, which is why I tell people, don't sit on your asses. You got to get involved somehow, anyhow. Use some of these tactics in reverse. Okay, until next time, we'll cover we'll be covering more of the day-to-day tactics of the left. So I've given you Otis. That's my dog, my new puppy. So anyway, I'm going to deal with him now, see what's bothering him. Take care, everyone.